This is about defending democracy. This is no longer Democrats versus Republicans. What do you want your kids to believe in? There must be give and take.
This is White Flag with Joe Walsh.
Former Congressman Joe Walsh here. So there's a group I've recently found and become a really big fan of called Starts With Us. They're a movement working to overcome the extreme political and cultural divisions in our country. Find them online at startswith.us/white flag. What I love about them is they're showing people how it's possible to have real, meaningful, productive conversations with people you disagree with. I'm such a big fan of this. This is what I've been trying to do with my podcast. Look, here's the deal right now. In America, we have two major political parties that are at each other's throats. And the most dangerous aspect of this is that way too many of us are avoiding having the hard conversations with people with whom we disagree. We're afraid to have these conversations, so we walk away. But to save our democracy, we have to stick around. I mean, if we're walking away from the table, then who the hell is sticking around to figure things out? This is what I so love and admire about the work that Starts With Us is doing. They are the movement of people like you and me who want to fight the extreme divisions in our country. Because guess what? We actually are in the majority. Starts With Us found that 87% of Americans are tired of how politically and culturally divided we are. So I'm not just a fan, I'm part of the movement. And if you're listening, I want you to join the movement too. Get involved. Go to startswith.us/white flag and sign up for their newsletter. Start there. Again, that's startswith.us/white flag. Joe Walsh, White Flag is the name of the podcast with Joe Walsh. White Flag, why White Flag? Because I was a jerk politically for a long time. I'm waving my white flag. It's not even a truce. I want to surrender. I want to sit down and talk to people every week who don't think like me. Listen to this podcast wherever you listen to podcasts, Spotify, Apple. Do me a favor, subscribe to my YouTube channel. Doesn't cost a thing. White Flag with Joe Walsh. I'm looking forward to this conversation. Nick Wilson, let me start, Nick, with the quick bio, is the Senior Director for Gun Violence and Prevention at the Center for American Progress and the Center for American Progress Action Fund. For those of you who don't know, the Center for American Progress is a good, independent, nonpartisan policy outfit dedicated to improving the lives of Americans through progressive ideas. In my day, we'd call it a good progressive think tank. Before Nick was there, he was the Associate Director of Policy Planning and Coordination at the Baltimore City Mayor's Office of Neighborhood Safety and Engagement. He's a UCLA grad, also a grad of Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. Hey, Nick, brother, thank you for coming on.
Good to see you again. Thanks for having me.
You as well. Every week is different. Sometimes I get people on here and I'm kind of weird politically these days, but sometimes I'll get a mega devotee on and we'll just talk broadly about everything we disagree with. Sometimes I'll get people on from the left and we'll do the same. I've been obsessed with beginning to have conversations about very specific issues to try to, because I think, Nick, there's so much like misinformation on all sides about certain issues. What I wanted to talk to you about was this concept of an assault weapons ban, and focus on that. What is it? What would it mean? What's the good and the bad? You and I disagree on it, but I want to have a really cool conversation about it. If I started there, Nick, and said, if I made you king of the world and you could snap your fingers, Give me what? How do you start to make your case for the notion of an assault weapons ban? And thanks for being with me, my friend.
Yeah, thanks for having me again. I actually don't get to talk about the assault weapon ban as often. I usually get a couple minutes to give the top 3 talking points. But there's a lot of people that are really passionate, that are on the ground talking about this every day. And so I've been looking forward to having kind of a more back and forth because I don't. It's also something I get to talk about all the time. Sometimes I get kind of put into more of the niche kind of new topics. And so I'm really excited to talk about this. And my kind of feelings about the assault weapon ban have changed over time as we've seen kind of how they're used and data. But to start, I think one way we talk about the assault weapon ban is that we're trying to reinstate the federal assault weapon ban that was in effect from 1994 that lapsed in 2005. Some people will say that it's not really a reinstation, the current bill, because it's actually the new bill closes some of the weaknesses and has some stronger language than the original one. But generally, the idea is, the Armalite kind of AR-15. There's different ways to define it, but it's a military-style kind of semi-automatic rifle. Usually, the lawyers will get into the weeds about, it has a detachable magazine. It has a couple different kind of features that are kind of define it. But it's defined a little bit differently in different places. 10 states plus D.C. currently have a ban of some sort on assault weapon bans. I think Delaware's had one last year. Washington and Illinois passed suit this year. Rhode Island is seriously considering one right now. So it's a very timely topic because most of the bans,
Why does it, Nick? Why does it make sense to you? This notion of banning this classification of guns, and and I don't even want to get into the issue of what is an assault weapon, and I know that there's misinformation on that. We can get into that a little bit, but this notion of banning a certain class of guns, these guns, why does that make sense to you?
So for a while, I wasn't as focused on the assault weapon ban because I thought it wasn't about the type of weapon themselves, but it was about having access to them. Yeah. If you ban assault weapons, you probably will not have less shootings. But the idea is assault weapon bans are the weapon of choice for people that want to kill as many people as possible. And so the idea of banning assault weapon would mean that there'll be less mass shootings and less fatalities per shooting. During the 10-year period, there was an assault weapon ban federally. Mass shooting fatalities were 70% less likely to occur compared to before and after the ban. So we saw that the people that really want to kill as many people, this is the weapon they choose because it's very well designed for lethality.
I think I'm right, Nick, when I say that even now, and what's so interesting is, and I'd love your perspective on this notion of mass shootings, and I'm older than you, seems to be a recent phenomenon. And when I say recent, I say in the last decade or two, especially pronounced. It sure feels like it in the last few years. But I think I'm right when I say that even now, in most mass shootings, handguns are still the weapon of choice, though increasingly we're seeing more and more AR-15s. Does that make sense? Does that kind of jive with what you think?
Yeah, that's true. For a while, people that wanted to do mass casualties might do explosives or bombs. I think people misremember Columbine, which was, I was in middle school, was a very important kind of moment in my life. That it was supposed to be on April 19th, which was the Waco anniversary, but it didn't work. So they did the 20th, and they actually had tons of explosives. And when they weren't very good explosive makers, when those didn't happen, they brought out the weapons and started firing. I think that kind of kicked off a trend where whether it's at a mall or a concert or at a school, that became the weapon of choice. Usually we'll see someone with at least one assault weapon and a handgun on their person when they're recovered. So usually it's not just one or the other, but I think there's a lot of momentum and a lot of changing in public opinion because, every month we see this horrific mass shooting that's kind of indiscriminate targeting kind of either a race or just a place. And the assault weapon means that they don't have to get up close and personal. And then the high capacity magazine means they can keep firing and firing. and killing more and more people as opposed to a handgun.
So I think the context here, Nick, is, and I think you'd agree with me that, and right away we're talking about mass shootings because I think you're right. I think the context when it comes to AR-15s and this type of assault weapon, we're primarily talking about how they're used in mass shootings. We're not talking about gun violence overall, and you'd agree that when it comes to gun violence overall, mass shootings are a small percentage of those killed by guns overall in this country, right? Like, I mean, 10, 12, 13, 14, 15,000 people are killed every year by guns. And I think generally 300, 400, 500 people are killed in mass shootings. That's about right. So we're talking about a smaller much smaller pool of victims than are killed nationwide every year by guns.
That has historically definitely been the case. And I got into the gun violence prevention movement not the same way as many of the people I work with.
Did you? I'm curious. How did you get in?
Yeah, so I think a lot of people I work with, and I'm really proud to work with a lot of survivors who have taught me a lot about their lived experience in this issue that's you can't get just from the numbers. And as a researcher, that's how I get a lot of information. And they've been personally impacted, usually by a mass shooting. But I was more interested in the everyday gun violence that we see, and where I grew up in Los Angeles, where I live now in Baltimore, where 12 people might be shot in a weekend and they won't even make the news because they weren't all shot at the same time by one person, but it's still devastating the community. And for me, I was like, the mass shootings get all the oxygen and all the attention and all the political attention, but really, if we want to save lives and reduce the number of gun deaths, you have to look at that kind of everyday retaliatory gun violence. But I'll say part of the reason why I'm here today to talk about assault weapons is because even in the streets of Baltimore, where there's maybe 20 million assault rifles in this country, that's now the weapon of choice for people that would, you would consider, in group violence or gang violence, and they'll, hit rivals over, drugs or petty disputes, or oftentimes, girls or social media. And now they'll just, instead of going up to somebody in execution style using a handgun and shooting them, they'll just jump out of a car and use an assault weapon with a, extended magazine, and then they'll just fire indiscriminately. I mean, the police in Baltimore just shot a 17-year-old man, a child, the other day because they saw that he had a weapon with an extended capacity magazine. And so it's unfortunately happening all in communities across our country as they become cheaper and more easily available.
Nick, I guess what's interesting is I'm a big gun guy and a big gun rights guy, and I appreciate your perspective on the other side of this debate. What's always driven me crazy is I think we focus on the wrong things. One of the reasons I oppose a ban on assault weapons is because I think it takes attention from so many other things that could make so much of a difference. That's interesting, though, what you said, that even on urban streets, typical gang crime, we're seeing more tactical rifles, more AR-15 style weapons being used as opposed to just handguns, huh?
Exactly. I hosted an event at CAP last month that was about how U.S. guns are flowing to Mexico and Central America and causing so much instability, by cartels or these organized crime. And, Mexico only has one gun store, and it's for, police. But it's not hard to find guns. But mostly it's assault rifles and 50 caliber sniper rifles, and they're all coming from Texas, Arizona, Florida gun shows just across the border. In my talking points, in kind of that I shared when I was preparing, I said in the United States, mass shootings, assault rifles make up a very small portion, but in Mexico, Guatemala, Honduras, Haiti, Venezuela, assault weapons are the weapon of choice. And then the Violence Policy Center actually told me they're working on a new analysis showing that exactly what I said, that in places across the country, in these urban communities and even some rural and suburban areas, that we're seeing a lot more use of assault weapons because they're very easy to shoot. they're accurate, and they can do, we can get into lethality later, but they're much more effective at killing your target.
No, that's kind of the yin and the yang, Nick, of the AR-15. This is why they're so popular with law-abiding Americans as well, because they're so easy to use, they're so accurate, there's very little recoil. It's why it's become the gun of choice among most law enforcement agencies in the country. I guess, Nick, one of my biggest beefs is, it's probably not my biggest beef, one of my biggest frustrations is when we talk about an assault weapons ban. We're talking about, and I think this is important for people to understand, we're talking about banning guns that are involved in annually less than 2% of gun crimes every year. Again, maybe 15, 16,000 people will be killed by guns this year. We're having a bad year when it comes to mass shootings, but maybe 500, 600 people will be killed of that 16,000 from mass shootings. And of the 500 or so who will be killed in mass shootings of the 16,000, maybe 200 to 300 of the 500 in mass shootings will be killed by AR-15s. And yet we're so focused on that. It seems to be distracting to me.
Yeah. So first I'll say that the numbers, they have been going up. So last year was 49,000 gun deaths. But then, if you exclude the suicides, which might be
I'm sorry, Nick. Yeah, I'm excluding suicides. I was just focused on the homicides.
Yeah, exactly. Right? And then there's more homicides than that now. And then I think what we don't do a good job of talking about is that for every homicide that's gun related, there might be 2 or 3 people that survive a gunshot, and it obviously has lifelong impacts on them. But yeah, I mean, that is a reason why there was a focus for a long time among the major gun violence prevention groups that, it's about access to firearms, and we need to make sure that people that are legally prohibited from having access to firearms don't have them, and focus less on it's a shotgun, a rifle, a handgun, assault rifle. And I think that, that argument, I think can still be made. But I think just looking at the news, looking at, if we look at Las Vegas, for example, and just how many people he was able to shoot, I mean, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people, it wouldn't have been possible without the assault weapon and either the bump stocks, or if he, God forbid, he had figured out how to convert them to fully automatic. And then from Sandy Hook to, Parkland, part of it's also, we see some law enforcement opposition, usually a little bit more privately because it's very political.
Yeah.
But, you saw if you watch the Uvalde shooting videos, the police didn't have ballistic shields that could withstand AR-15 rounds. And that, was another contributing factor to more people being shot because they were pretty much outgunned in a lot of ways.
Yeah, well, they stood in that hallway, Nick. My God, they didn't do their job. You and I would have run.
Same thing with Parkland, yeah.
BB guns, you and I would have run. No, is it okay? So to stupidly generalize, Nick Wilson, if mass shootings didn't exist, would we be talking about AR-15s? It seems to me the reason we're talking about assault weapons again is because of mass shootings.
That's exactly right. I mean, after the ban expired, mass shooting deaths increased by 347%. So I think part of it is that we define a mass shooting by 4 or more people being injured, excluding the perpetrator. But if people were using a shotgun, we might not get to that 4-person, threshold or, a handgun. And so it's kind of hard because I feel like mass shootings are they become a mass shooting because sometimes of the lethality. But if we're talking about just indiscriminate shooting, whether it's hate motivated or just someone who, I think a lot of mass shootings are people that they're suicidal and they want to take other people out with them and do death by cop or elsewhere. So I think it is, these very public mass shootings where, voters, they were like, oh, if I don't live in Chicago or, Baltimore or Compton, gun violence doesn't really affect me. But a mass shooting really makes everyone very concerned. And I think part of it is the reason why we have so many drills in schools is because of these mass shooters. And you talk to parents, and some of them are, join our movement or at least become more active because they're tired of seeing their 4-year-olds have to hide under desks. And those are because of mass shootings.
So here's my question, Nick. And I think you're right. I think when we look overall at gun violence in America every day and every year, it's not an issue of assault weapons. Because again, the vast majority of homicides and suicides in this country, the vast majority, are committed with handguns. So assault weapons don't enter the discussion when we talk overall about gun violence. We're talking about this issue of mass shootings. And my question, Nick, is, and hit me over the head if I'm wrong, but it seems like a recent phenomenon. These guns, AR-15s and the like, have been around for a while. It seems like we should be focusing on why this recent phenomena of mass shootings. Does that make sense?
It does. So when we look at legislation or cultural changes or just different policies for gun violence, we usually, you'll hear us say that, not one gun law or not one policy will solve this problem. Yeah. That's because we have to kind of take the pie chart and we have to, the biggest part is suicide. We have to figure out how do we, remove firearms from people temporarily that are at high risk of suicide. And so that might mean some legislative changes, making it a little bit harder access, as well as, I think more importantly, big cultural changes where I like to talk to, gun owners and my friends about how you don't need to get law enforcement or the laws involved or the Second Amendment involved. If you have a friend that recently lost their job, is going through a divorce, you could tell they're going through a tough time, just say, hey, buddy, just, let me hold on to your gun. Let me put in my gun safe just for a little bit, and I'll give it back to you, when you're feeling a bit better. We need to be more comfortable having those cultural changes. But then we look at, all right, in places like Baltimore, a lot of people that are committing this gun violence, they already are legally prohibited from having firearms, but they're still able to get them. So that's where when we talk about things like, more background checks, licensing and registration, so that way, we can.
Now, Nick, even a crazy ass gun guy like me is going to sit down at a table with you because, a lot of that shit makes a lot of sense to me. It's when we talk about banning a certain gun that I get lost. But back up for a moment. And maybe this is impossible to answer, my friend. Why do you think we have this phenomenon of mass shootings, Mr. Senior Director of Gun Safety, Gun Violence and Prevention? Where does this come from?
It's a great question, and I think it honestly has been changing over the years. I think we're seeing, as I mentioned, more kind of white supremacist or hate motivated, where they just want to hurt the LGBT community or certain races. I think for a while we were seeing a lot of copycats and people wanting to get their name out there, and that's why the No Notoriety campaign was started, or encouraging people not to publish manifestos because they were trying to get their name out there. And we'll see, after a mass shooting where someone gets a lot of attention, we'll see some more mass shootings happen right afterwards. Yeah. So I think there's part of that. And then again, some people just are angry and they have easy access to something to do this damage. So I think why assault weapons are being chosen. I think it's pretty interesting just looking at the history of these, where for a while marketers of these early AR-15s, NRA members would walk by the booth and at a convention and give them the finger and be all upset. Yeah. But then the expiration happened around the same time as we're going into Iraq and Afghanistan, and they were really, people wanted to what the military was having or the police was having. That's why they called it the M&P 15 by Smith & Wesson. And I think it's, and then Call of Duty, you can't underestimate
the
just
videos,
people want that, and they already are familiar with their weapons, and they build them to look just like that. And so I think there's a lot of different reasons why people want to commit mass shootings, and that's what makes it really hard for us, is that there's no, when the Secret Service try to figure out what is the profile of a mass shooter, it's very different now, and that's why our best thing we can do right now is we can do these extremist protection orders or red flags when we know somebody is at they're talking. Usually, they talk about a mass shooting. They tell a friend they're going to do this. We temporarily remove firearms, and the next best thing we can do is hope that they substitute an assault rifle with something that is less lethal. But that's not going to prevent the shooting from happening in the first place. But it might lead to less.
Am I right, Nick, in that still, even now, even though the assault weapon gets the headline, the weapon of most mass shootings, the weapon of choice is still a handgun? That may be changing. Certainly, I think you'd be right in that the deadliest recent mass shootings have involved AR-15s, assault weapons. But handguns are still primarily the weapon of choice, even in most mass shootings, semi-automatic handguns.
I think that's right. I think it is the people that really want to rack up the body count and get their numbers on the board, which I think is part of the motivation. I think that is the assault weapon. But for sure, I think for a while, maybe a little inside information for people that don't know this is that for a while the movement generally wasn't pushing for assault weapon ban. We were thinking, all right, it's actually the high capacity magazines that are the problem because, not only can you shoot more people, but then there's not the reload time is really an opportunity for a bystander to intervene. The Gabby Gifford shooting, it was someone was, an unarmed woman was able to tackle the shooters and disarm them because a gun will jam or they'll have to reload. But honestly, what's interesting is, when I was in Maine and talking to gun owners for many years, a lot of them were, especially the hunters with a proud tradition of responsible gun ownership. They wouldn't want to talk to me about the high capacity magazine, but they're like, I support an assault weapon ban, even though by definition that includes a ban on high capacity magazines. But we're seeing a lot of these assault pistols being used. We saw that in the Nashville shooting, where it included a pistol brace, which was something that we weren't really talking about, but it's become more of an issue. But yeah, you're right that if we want to really reduce gun violence, we need to really focus on the access to firearms. And I think it's interesting. I think it's worth kind of being clear that the more we talk about an assault weapon ban, sometimes I think that does fuel more people wanting to purchase an assault weapon.
Completely.
We saw the huge spike when right before Obama was elected. People are being afraid of it being banned, and they'll go out. I still see people saying that they kind of, I don't really want an assault weapon. It's very expensive with all the ammo, but they kind of want to thumb their nose at people like me that want to do this ban. And
Nick, it's become a symbol, no doubt.
I'm helping sell guns, I'm sure. But so that is hard because, and again, what's different about current pushes for assault weapon compared to the federal ban before is, some proponents now want to do a buyback or having to register existing stockpiles. And I always, I have a hard time sometimes with wanting to take guns away from people that that legally bought them at the time.
Yeah.
I think it plays into these ridiculous confiscation kind of worst case scenarios, talking points. And also, but again, now that there's 20 million out there, it's still fairly easy if someone wants to commit a mass shooting to do it. But we often see that these assault rifles are bought right before the mass shooting, a lot of times on credit cards that they have no intention of paying off. So there's been some movement by credit card companies that want to be like, hey, stop buying these, 20 guns on this.
And interestingly, Nick, they're bought often in heavy numbers right after mass shootings because the fear then is, okay, the government's going to do something. One of my big beefs against an assault weapon ban is it will not make a difference, period. I wanted you on because I know you're more knowledgeable about this issue than I am. But as I looked at the research, Nick, and again, disagree with whatever you want to disagree with, when it comes to the assault weapon that was in place 94 to 2004, the evidence to me is pretty darn inconclusive as to whether that made any difference. And in a few of the studies I've looked at in the last 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 years, again, pretty inconclusive that any assault weapon ban will have any impact on mass shootings. And you probably know all of these studies. Gun violence in general, that there's no real relationship, significant relationship between either a large capacity magazine ban and gun violence, homicide rates. I don't. Again, I'm worried that we're just focused on 200 to 300 people getting killed by this gun a year, as opposed to the 20,000 getting killed by guns. But I don't see the evidence that bans have made a lot of difference. But chew me up if you want.
So yeah, there was a lot of conflicting research after the assault weapon ban, federal one, expired, and I do think it wasn't as conclusive as people would think. But I think that's partly because there was nothing to do with existing assault rifles, so theirs was still there, as well as it was not a very well written, and it was had a lot of loopholes. And the way they define assault weapon, I don't think was very strong. And I think the new assault weapon ban tries to clarify that.
My good younger friend, let me hit you upside the head right there. Isn't that, and this is my other beef, these things don't make sense. Isn't that intrinsic in this issue? We're going to ban these kinds of guns, and 10 states have done it, with all of these features. And I think that the proof is that then people in these states have creatively gone out of their way to format and put together guns. One of the beauties of the AR-15 and some of these assault weapons is they're so flexible in what you can create that you can just get around whatever is deemed assault weapon by the state of Illinois or Washington. Isn't that an endemic problem here?
That was definitely a problem with the federal ban. They would try to define it by the certain grip or barrel, and then you can make cosmetic changes and get around that. And so that was the big kind of loopholes in those. I think it's more important to focus on what makes an assault weapon, more lethal than other weapons. I mean, a 9mm handgun has about 300 to 400 pounds of force. But then an AR-15 will have 1,300 pounds of force, and the way the bullet works in the AR-15, it will tumble or yaw, and it'll instead of a handgun that will just have a pretty much a very similar exit wound to where it entered. Assault weapon, the bullet might destroy organs. It'll go through. Instead of going through a bone, it will just shatter a bone. So we've talked a lot to surgeons that are seeing these every day and saying there is a big difference and it is killing more people. But it's still going to be a challenge. There's so many assault AR-15 manufacturers now. It really dominates a lot of the market now. And when I was in Maine, there'd be, I think I counted 13 people that might be, making these weapons out of, a garage or you can just order things online. And so that's always going to be a problem, but I don't think it's insurmountable. I think about, we don't see a lot of fully automatic weapons on the street. People, there are exceptions. I grew up with, my father had an Uzi, Israeli-made Uzi in his sock drawer. When my mother when he passed away and gave it to the sheriff had a lot of questions about how we had that. And maybe I wasn't very happy. That's how she decided to get rid of it. But I do think that, we
draw lines. We draw lines,
Yeah.
and the nation and our law and our political system has drawn a line in that automatic weapons are illegal. You can't have one unless you're a certain special class of whatever. This is part of what drives me crazy, Nick. I know you get this. There's disinformation on all sides, but so many people think AR-15s are automatic weapons. But you're right. So we've drawn a line at automatic weapons. AR-15s are semi-automatic. Every pull of the trigger, boom. And I think a lot of people, Nick, don't realize that virtually every handgun sold in America today is semi-automatic. And 95% of rifles sold in America today are semi-automatic. And there are certainly rifles more lethal than the AR-15, larger fires that wouldn't be banned. It just doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah, I was thinking about, one thing that's interesting about, because one interesting thing about the AR-15 as well and the similar, rifles is that now you can 3D print a little piece of plastic that makes it, an auto sear, and like ATF are seeing those recovered and across the country. And I think the fact that these are so customizable, I think it can get around some of those and things like a bump stock, and or you can just, it's not that hard with, give someone an hour. You can turn an AR-15 into a fully automatic. But I'm glad you mentioned that, because you don't know how many times I've talked to a politician that are like, I got this bill, it's going to ban all semi-automatic weapons. I was like, please don't do that. As much as when I go hunting or target shooting, I prefer, I love target shooting with a single action rifle or a shotgun. I think a shotgun is the best home defense. If you're going to have a gun for home defense, because I don't like the idea of an assault rifle, that bullet might go through your wall, might hit, we always hear about neighbors or their own children being shot. You don't have those issues. But I think it's ridiculous to try to go back to the olden days when we just had revolvers and shotguns and single action.
Well, I think that's, I think it's impossible. And I think everybody listening to us right now, many of whom would be on your side of this conversation, need to understand that damn near every gun sold in America today is semi-automatic, period. Just like the AR-15, the handgun, they're all the same. They're semi-automatic. One pull of the trigger, a bullet goes. The rate of fire between handguns and AR-15s is virtually identical. Like any rifle, the AR-15 is more lethal than a handgun, but there are rifles more lethal than AR-15s that nobody's talking about banning. But Nick, it is interesting. 1 out of every 4 guns sold in America today is an AR-15. It's become the modern sporting rifle. The Washington Post did a hell of a series a few weeks ago, or surveyed AR-15 owners. Why do they own them? Talking to actual owners, I think that the predominant reason was self-defense, home, family, and all the rest. And as you said, there are 20 to 30 million out there right now. Practically, could you do it? Could you ban them? Or have we passed that point?
I think that's a great question. I think we can, with the caveat that we don't know what the Supreme Court would say.
Yes, you and I do.
After the Heller decision, they said that banning assault weapons is fair game. They've said it even more recently than that. But again, with this kind of more activist Supreme Court, I wouldn't be surprised if they strike down the existing state level bans. That there is evidence that they are working, but there weren't assault weapons back when the country was founded, so there's no analog.
Right.
And I do think going back to the self defense, if you ask any gun owner, I think not any gun owner, but if you ask a lot of gun owners now, why they own a gun in general, it's the self defense argument, which is obviously very different than probably when you grew up, where people were living in rural areas where they might either as part of hunting or as part of shooting that squirrel if that's been bothering you, or there were other reasons. There were predators around, but after people started moving to the cities, moving to the suburbs, gun sales were really down, and this assault rifle was really a lifeline to a lot of gun companies that might have otherwise gone out of business. And so I think the Washington Post article, that series about American Icon, I would encourage everyone on all sides to read it, because there's a lot of great interviews by former gun executives and people that were marketing these and saying like, consider your man guard reissued, was how Bushmaster said, or use what they use, and they show helmeted soldiers. And I don't know I believe that statistic is right, the survey. I'm just that 1/4 of people that don't. But I wonder if that's people. When I was in Maine, where we had no gun laws, whenever I knew I was making some progress on some common sense kind of politically moderate things, when people would show up with their gun on their hip anywhere I spoke, and with their black Black Rifles Matter T-shirts, or Gun Save Lives T-shirts, and they really, it's interesting. I think both sides have done this, where a lot of the more kind of extremist kind of, being a gun owner is really an important part of their identity and much more political about it. They want to defend what's the most, maligned, or they would say misunderstood gun. And I think some of the individuals that have been really pushing for this assault weapon ban for the past 10 years since Sandy Hook, they said that they chose something that was very difficult because they thought somebody needed to be working on this, because a lot of the more mainstream groups might have been looking for something that was more politically possible. So I think when people answer these polls, I don't know if they're being genuine or if they've really been taught by and maybe they've been taught by all this by their friends. Maybe they believe assault rifles are the best home defense, which I would strongly disagree. I will say that they are super fun to shoot. I'm an Eagle Scout. I used to run rifle ranges. When I ran rifle ranges, it was during the assault weapon ban for a long time. But we would, when the adults would get there a day early, we would, they would bring out the fully automatic weapons or the semi-automatic, and they were a lot of fun to shoot. Didn't hurt my shoulder after after a lot of clay pigeons. So I think it shouldn't be like it used to be, where if you want to shoot these, you got to go to Vegas, you got to go somewhere where it's tightly controlled. You can't bring it home, but I think there's an experience to be able to kind of experience what it's like to shoot guns that the military use. But I don't think we should be able to kind of take them home, because they're not. We would hear about it all the time if they were used for self-defense a lot, but instead we hear about how they're used for mass shootings.
Well, but interesting point, and you're right. The Washington Post poll, when they surveyed AR-15 owners, 33% said self-defense, home, self, family. 15%, Nick, said fun, recreation, and sport. Another 15% said target shooting, range, competition. 12% said it's my right. 12% said hunting, and then down the line. I think people who don't know what an AR-15, and that's why I appreciate you, Nick, people who would like to ban them who don't know what they are need to at least understand that they are extremely popular. They're popular among it's probably the most popular gun to buy in America right now. And as you said, they're easy to learn how to shoot. They are incredibly accurate. You're right. You don't have a bruised shoulder when you're done at the range with them. My wife can handle an AR-15 easier than she can a shotgun or a heavier rifle. And again, there's a reason why law enforcement uses them, but then I can't be two-faced, Nick. It's an easier gun to use for somebody who wants to go out there and try to accurately mow down a bunch of people as well. So that it does go both ways.
I mean, that is why they, the Eugene Stoner, the World War II veteran who invented it in the late 1950s when he was at Armalite, where obviously the AR comes from, he thought of it as just the military side of the house, but it's the idea of, you can hand these to any 18-year-old, and with just, an hour of prep, they can, handle it well, which is a lot different than a lot of other firearms. And
but isn't that a problem, Nick? Because it's become the modern sporting rifle. I mean, 20 to 30 million of them out there right now, and 99% of the people that use them are law-abiding Americans who use them properly. But it's become the modern sporting rifle. I don't know how you take that away. I think it would be really difficult to take away.
It would be. I mean, we don't outside of a couple, a few states like Hawaii and Chicago and Massachusetts that have strong gun laws and the lowest gun deaths, we don't have any idea of who owns these guns. And so, even if we did a mandatory buyback like Australia, we would see what they did in Australia. Some people would bury them in the ground or keep them in an attic. And so what to do about that existing stockpile, which again, I think it's 24% of guns being produced now. That's a very difficult question. And I think there's no great answers. It really depends on your politics at that point, whether you think it's worth taking those away. But I do think that, if we ban them now or regulate them now, it will take maybe a decade for us to see, a huge difference. But we will see, I think, a difference in the mass shootings where people, especially these 18, 19, and 20-year-olds that we keep seeing kind of more recent mass shootings, that, it's going to be a lot harder for them to find it. I mean, I'm sure a lot of your listeners that grew up around firearms have a lot of friends. My friends in California, strong gun laws, have an assault weapon ban. He knows who to call up, and they'll, come from Arizona, and they'll have a trunk, and they'll have the assault rifles. They'll have, fully automatic. I've been with my friends who have gone to gun dealers and kind of, oh, you look like you're not going to get me in trouble. This probably won't come back on me. Let's not do the paperwork. We'll say it's a private sale. And like, there's a way, there's so many loopholes around it, and the ATF hasn't been able to enforce or do inspections that it is going to be very difficult. But I think just looking at the research from the state laws, it does show that even these imperfect restrictions do have an impact, but it won't solve the problem completely.
When we're done with this, and you and I are going to stay in touch, because I want to see some of those state studies, because some of the state studies I've looked at, I mean, if people ask me, would a ban on us, I mean, I oppose it on constitutional grounds. I think it's wrong. I don't think it's fair. But if people ask me, would a ban on assault weapons make a difference? The best I can come up with is all of the data out there I've seen shows that it's inconclusive. That's the best I can come up with. You, Nick, would probably feel a little more strongly that it has made and may make a difference.
And I think part of the two things with the state research, one is until recently there was no federal funding for research, and so there's a lot of things that we just don't know, but we have pretty good ideas now. And then the other, as I said, with the state, my friends that are even ones that are getting just into guns in California, they're able to get a gun, from another state without a background check. We'd always have incidences in Maine where someone would meet in a Walmart parking lot, buy an assault rifle, it's loaded, they accidentally, shoot the person, or, those are so I think that's why it needs to happen at the federal level. It's sort of like background checks. I think closing the gun show loophole, that is necessary, because that is a loophole that people are able to exploit all the time. But I don't think it's going to solve more than a couple % of shootings, because there's still so many other ways to get access to those firearms. You just have to go work a little bit harder. And so it's not just one law that's going to solve this. It needs to be tightening up all of these loose regulations. And also, again, we talk so much about, prosecuting people for doing the wrong thing, or shutting down gun dealers. But I think we also need to talk about culture. I think, you talking to your listeners about responsible gun ownership. And for me, everybody has a different definition. For me, it means, are you keeping up to date with the laws of what you should and shouldn't be doing? Are you going to the range and, making sure that you know how to handle it? It means, making sure you don't sell it to somebody without at least seeing their ID and doing a background check, even if it's not important in your state. But the idea being, when I grew up, we didn't call them weapons, we called them firearms. We had a lot of respect for that. These are, having a gun is a risk factor, but there's a lot of different ways to minimize them.
No, just to buttress your point, forget about when I grew up. When I was in Congress 10 years ago, I didn't send out Christmas cards with me and my family holding our favorite AR-15s. Now I look at members of Congress, Republicans, sending out those Christmas cards. So something's gone fucking haywire in the gun culture in this country. I completely agree.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Nutty. Look, and you know this, Nick, when I was in Congress, man, if the NRA said something, you tended to hop. Fuck the NRA, and I don't think they're as influential, and I think gun owners like me are are beginning to get pissed off. But it's scary to me, because I'm a hardcore gun guy. But it's scary to me how people on my side, especially elected officials, just flaunt this stuff.
Yeah, I mean, the NRA is in a very weakened position. I think they really had a peak in 2016, so much so that, because they spent $50 million to help get Trump and a few Republican senators elected. And so much that, after, one mass shooting, Trump was like, maybe we should just ban assault rifles. You have to remember, he's from New York, right? He's not used to being around these people.
And then they're like, to remember he has no core, but continue.
Yeah, that's something else we agree on. But then they're like, you don't want to piss off the NRA, and he's like, oh yeah, that's right. But now, the NRA is in a weakened position. I can't believe someone didn't warn them. Maybe getting Oliver North to be your president might backfire, might not be the best choice.
Yeah.
But but other more extreme groups, I consider the Gun Owners of America to be much more extreme. They just got caught leaking ATF. They got leaked to information from ATF being like, hey, there's going to be an inspection at your place. We know you're probably selling guns out, the back door, here, go prepare. But I think even with the NRA being weakened, they've won a lot of the argument that they don't even need to give much more money, because I think what I consider the gun miss, you might disagree with them, but the big miss I think that the NRA pushed is that guns make you safer. Only good guy with a gun can stop a bad guy with a gun. And then the Second Amendment is a completely it's a complete right infringible to own any firearm anytime, carry it anywhere. That getting rid of the well-regulated militia part. And those are like really mainstream. I mean, we see the National Shooting Sports Foundation doesn't get into as much of the culture wars, but they're they're very powerful, and they represent the gun manufacturers and dealers. And when they saw the declining gun sales, they hired a advertising firm to help them figure out how to sell guns to people that never would have thought about buying guns before. And I was kind of disgusted reading through, they would be like, all right, weaponless Wendy is what they called, a woman that you're like, all right, you have to tell them that they're going to be, sexually assaulted or shot if they don't carry a gun. And so we can sell them a pink gun in their purse that they carry everywhere. They had unarmed Aaron. We're hearing that they've been really targeting the Asian American community, especially in places like California after the Monterey Park. And they're like, hey, and in other places they're like, there's a lot of anti-Asian hate. Someone might shoot you. You need to have a gun to protect yourself. And then also, we hear that they want to get rid of this image of mass shooters just being white guys. And so they're trying to encourage other Asians to become mass shooters so they can be like, hey, see, it's not a white person problem. And so I think that market, I think it's really the marketing is a big part of that.
But Nick, on that point, they're marketing and trying to sell a legal product like bubblegum and pizza. They want to sell as many pieces of bubblegum and pizza as they can. I don't know. And clearly, gun sales are up among women and African Americans and probably Asians. How isn't that just our market at work? Even though it's not pizza, it's a handgun. I mean,
yeah, that's correct. I mean, it's a slightly different topic, but there's a lot of interest in Congress around how guns are marketed, and I think the argument can be made that some of them do violate some certain laws, or it's up to Congress to regulate it the same way they regulated, tobacco, where, stopped having Joe Camels, or, marijuana now is the same question of, it's legal. It doesn't really hurt adults, but it's not great for young people, for their brain development to be taking it. So there is a legitimate reason to, I think where I focus my energy is that we shouldn't be marketing these kind of firearms to young people, which kind of we've seen. And then there's some efforts by groups like Project Unloaded that are trying to help young people recognize that, guns do have risks and there's ways to mitigate those risks. But yeah, I don't necessarily blame the companies, legally. But it's interesting just to see that some of the people that were involved early on in marketing these assault rifles, they've really spoken up publicly about it, how they're very uncomfortable with how far it's gotten.
Yeah, and I think, Nick, I think a lot of it is marketing, why these became so popular. Some of it was post 9/11. Some of it was the election of Obama. Some of it was the mass shootings themselves. We talked about that, but after Newtown, sales of AR-15s spiked, and it really did become then kind of a political symbol. And I'd combine that, Nick, with the fact that, as you've said and I've said, it's a fun, easy, accurate firearm to use. It's like the industry has produced a rifle that anybody can use for self-defense for good reasons and bad.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of like, but we've done this before. I mean, the Tommy gun used to be pretty easy to buy, and we saw, not only the damage, but the people that were choosing to use it.
I think the difference here, Nick, is that, and that's a really good point, and you're right that the government needs to draw lines because no right is every right. No right is unlimited, and the Second Amendment needs to be regulated like every other amendment. But I think the danger here for me is, at the end of the day, it's a semi-automatic rifle, and there are a lot of semi-automatic rifles out there. Every handgun is basically semi-automatic. I just think when you begin to try to ban certain semi-automatic guns, I'm exaggerating, when every gun in America sold today is semi-automatic, you've entered an area of overreach that I just don't think will be tenable, even for most gun owners. Respond to that, though.
Yeah, I think whether it is or is not overreach is something that we could debate, but I think the message it sends, and I think, again, why some people have really taken up this, the Black Rifle Coffee Company or like these organizations, is because I think they are afraid that if we're able to do this, then we'll be able to ban other firearms. I will point to that, we only banned assault rifles during the 94 to 2004, and we didn't try as a movement to go after other guns. But that's why I think that, if we want to do something about mass shootings, which is what voters are clamoring their elected officials to do something about, this is one of, the few things that it's really focused on on mass shootings. But I would prefer to see, as I said, you can buy handguns, rifles, shotguns, assault rifles if you aren't legally prohibited, if you go through live fire training, maybe you have insurance, we can go. I'd rather focus on that. And that's where the ghost guns thing is. That is another area where, we're not trying to ban those type of guns. We just want there to be a serial number on them. So that way, when they're recovered at a crime scene, we can at least start to get a sense of how these guns made it into this community. And for me, I've been writing a lot about how I wish ATF would spend less of their time focusing on, after the fact, coming to a scene of a crime and trying to prosecute the person that did that individual shooting, which, I think that's left to local law enforcement. I think we need to go upstream and go after the very small number of gun dealers that are not following federal law. Again, it's a very, very small number. I debate with some of my own colleagues. They're like, they want the ATF to stop talking to the National Shooting Sports Foundation. They want them to start talking to gun dealers and manufacturers. I'm like, 99% of those times, those dealers and manufacturers just want to know what the law is so they can be in compliance because they just want to do the right thing. But I do think there are people that are, especially these straw purchasing rings, that, those are the people that are really helping drive the violence in this community and arming through this pipeline these actors that are committing most of the shooting we see in a community. And so there's a lot of other things that need to be done, but
agreed.
Yeah.
Agreed, Nick. Let me delve into one other or two other quick areas before we wrap. And if I'm to summarize me, to me, an assault weapons ban makes no sense because I don't understand what makes these types of guns any distinguishable from all the other semi-automatic, some less lethal, some more lethal guns out there. The evidence to me, Nick, shows it didn't make a difference, and I don't think it will. I'm anxious to see some of the research you've seen. I don't think it's fair to ban these guns because it's become the most popular rifle in America. The final piece, Nick, let's banter back and forth for a sec. I don't think it's constitutional. I guess I'd argue that it never should be constitutional. It's just a unless you're going to make all semi-automatic guns unconstitutional. But especially post the New York Bruin case, these guns now are in common use. And it seems to me like this Supreme Court is going to shoot down these bans in these 9 to 10 states right now. What's your thought on that?
So I think it's important for me to do the normal caveat that
you do whatever you want. This is your show.
Thank you. From the time of the Bill of Rights until maybe the 70s or 80s or even 90s, that it was very settled constitutional law that the Second Amendment applies towards well-regulated militias, and there was
start. The ninth
I know.
inning. You come in the ninth.
I told you I had to start with that. Michael, you can get Michael Waldman on. His book about this is excellent. So I will say that I think from the constitutional standpoint, until very recently, these assault weapon bans and banning Tommy guns and fully automatic, I think that's all constitutional. Now going into this, where we've had 2 stolen seats and we've had,
Wait, back up. Hold on. Stop for a second. I agree with you on the politics of those seats,
Yeah.
Nick. I'm with you. Let me just, and we're not going to get into this because I would need 3 hours, and I love you for bringing this up. But just answer me this. In my reading of history, our history and the law, the Second Amendment is much more an individual right than a collective right. But generally, how would Nick Wilson respond to that?
That throughout almost all of history, it was a collective right. And then the NRA was able to, noticing that constitutional scholars on the center and the left, they thought it was settled law, so they wouldn't write about it. They wouldn't write about it in journals like, oh, we all agree this is a collective right. And so then they would pay, a small number of academics and law students to build up this huge amount of legal, and they would cite each other, and it was just enough for then a politicized court to be able to make that decision. And I'll also say that I think gun manufacturing assault rifles went up hugely, not just because of demand, but ahead of Obama, ahead of people believing there was going to be a ban. And so it kind of also became common use, partly to make it constitutional. I think people can make that argument that it became common use because they made enough and intentionally sold enough.
I get that, Nick, and I like the fact that you snuck that in there. I'm loving this conversation with you. But you would also agree that it also became of common use because these are really easy, accurate rifles to use.
Which is why the military uses them, and I would say a grenade is pretty easy to use as well. Pull a pin and throw it, but we've decided to regulate those as well.
No, agreed. And no right is absolute, and we as a society draw a line. I'm with you there, Nick Wilson. You and I cannot walk around Washington D.C. and with grenades.
But can I say one more thing that might be answering your question that you actually wanted me to answer? Is that I think for a long time, and I still think some of my, some people that are not doing this full time, that aren't, didn't grow up with firearms, haven't, many survivors probably have never shot a firearm. I think a lot of liberals just might be like, ooh, it's a black rifle and it looks militaristic, and it's not wood and it looks scary. And I think that's a terrible reason to regulate a firearm. But I think if people go and look at Washington Post or CNN, there's videos of just how these smaller bullets, how much more velocity is, how much they move, that they are much more destructive than any other, handgun or rifle. So I think that's why there's a legitimate argument to be made that that's not necessary for self-defense to have a bullet that can do that much destruction or shatter bones or liquefy organs.
Then would you? And I agreed. It's the AR-15 is more lethal than the typical handgun. The rate of fire is the same, I think, but it's more lethal. But wouldn't you just agree that, generally rifles are more lethal than handguns? And there are certainly rifles that are more lethal than AR-15s. But Nick, it's like the military doesn't use the AR-15. It's taken from like the M16, which is what the military used. It's not, the AR-15 is not used on the battlefield. I want people to understand that, because we get confused about that. But Nick, to the Constitution. Oh, by the way, do you drink?
Yep.
What's your alcohol of choice?
I was a big whiskey guy, and then I fell in love with rum because I found out I could get some real 12-year-old, Barbados rum that for like $30. You can't, whiskey's gotten so expensive that rum you can get something that's.
Rum you can get, rum you can get really good cheap rum. I'm a tequila guy myself. You and I, with alcohol, will get into the conversation about the history of the Second Amendment, because I find it to be just fascinating. And it is important, I think, for people to think about how we got here. But you would acknowledge with me, Nick, that common use, where we are now with the court, you wouldn't be surprised if these state assault weapon bans were overturned.
That's exactly right. It's not something that people welcome me saying in meetings with these mass shooting survivors that are pushing it. But if I'm being realistic and have to figure out where to spend most of my energy, I do think that with this current Supreme Court, I think assault weapons might be one of the first things that they strike down. And with the shadow docket, where it could happen without us even having much notice. I think that's why a lot of the major gun groups, CAP's not one of them, but a lot of the major gun groups have signed on to expand the Supreme Court and other things, because they believe that this is kind of an existential crisis to not only passing new gun laws, but existing gun laws. And after Bruin decision, when we had our conference, that was the first thing we had to talk about is we asked all our experts, what laws can we pass that aren't going to be struck down? And nobody really knows. It's going to take years, I think, for us to know. But every day you'll see the Firearm Policy Coalition filing new lawsuits, and we'll see one judge. In California, they go judge shopping. They found the one judge they like, and then he's taking them all on. But then we'll see, just last week, the raising the age from 18 to 21 to buy a gun was struck down by one federal judge, but it was upheld by a Florida judge. And so we kind of have to wait and see, but I'm not holding my breath that it's going to survive a constitutional challenge.
Well, you're right, Nick. We do have to wait and see. You and I would agree that I think something's going to get up to the Supreme Court pretty quickly. In my state of Illinois, you had a federal judge that temporarily blocked Illinois' ban, and another federal judge that didn't block it. For people listening to us, they need to understand that the New York Bruin case kind of affirmed the constitutional right to keep and bear arms for self-defense, and then you combine that with the common use area. It would be difficult to ban a gun that is purchased, one out of every 4 guns that are purchased out there right now. It's the most popular gun in America. Nick, I'm going to close with 2 quick questions. And I want to be better about this. And this has been fun. Thank you for letting me take some of your time. It's so fun to talk to an expert, but an expert who has some fucking personality. Rum! I used to be a big rum drinker, but then, Nick, I was told by my doctor that tequila is better for my gut than rum. You and I are making our closing arguments. We're in front of 10,000 people right now. Give your one final plea. What's the one final thing you would say for why we need an assault weapons ban?
Well, as you know, I'm not a man of a few words, but I'll say that again, I like many of you, I see the news where we see these horrific school shootings, these kids being killed, and we just wonder, like, what can we do? And I think the assault weapon ban is one of the few things that, we've done it in the recent past. There's not perfect evidence, but there's good evidence that it made a difference and saved lives and had, 40% decrease in mass shooting deaths. And the lethality of it is, I always think back to kind of Uvalde where, why aren't they kind of just fingerprinting the kids or identifying the kids? And because it was an assault weapon, these kids didn't have, I'm sorry to say this, but they, their heads were completely blown off and they could not be identified. And I think about the parents that that have lost their children to that. And if we can, I know it's asking a lot for people to sell their assault rifle or not buy one, or do a buyback. And I hate, when we're like, oh, we got to destroy these guns. I think that's kind of a waste of someone who does respect the history, craftsmanship of firearms. But I think there's other weapons to do hunting with, target shooting, and I don't think there's any need for an assault weapon. And so even if we don't get a federal assault weapon ban, I would just hope that people would think about how these guns are uniquely contributing to gun violence in our communities, and as well as the manufacture of them here is, selling them to Mexico, where we're leading to, it's a huge problem with the migration crisis and fentanyl. You can't bring fentanyl in this country, unless you're armed, and the assault weapons and, 50 caliber guns are the only guns they're using because they're the most effective for shooting down, police or the 50 caliber, helicopters. And so I just think that it's a small thing to do.
Mr. Moderator, my colleague here went over his 30-second time. You were right. You couldn't limit it, but I get it, and I appreciate it, Nick, and I love the fact that you're so committed to this issue. I will take 20 or 30 seconds because to me, it's inane to me that, and I get why we want to do it because they're scary looking guns and they wig people out. I get all of that. But we're talking about banning guns that have that figure in less than 2% of gun crimes every year. It won't make a difference, and it takes away from things we could do and should do, Nick, which I think is focusing on doing a hell of a lot more upfront before any kind of gun is bought to make sure that somebody who shouldn't have a gun doesn't have a gun. Better background checks, more robust background checks, permitting systems, training. I love the notion, Nick, and I don't know what you think about this. Violent crime. Why just a violent felony? How about a violent misdemeanor precludes you from purchasing a gun? I think there's so much more we can do up front instead of talking about banning a gun. Nick Wilson has been my guest. Nick, you're wonderful. He's the Senior Director for Gun Violence and Prevention at the Center for American Progress. By the way, you can follow him on Twitter at Nick Wilson B. The Center for American Progress. It doesn't matter who you are politically, they're a wonderful organization that puts out a lot of good information, plenty of which I disagree with, but it's always good and interesting. Nick, thank you, my friend.
Thank you. First, tequila's on me when we get together.
Thanks, boss. Joe Walsh here, governmentauction.com. It's a live auction site where you bid against other people interested in land, jewelry, coins, all kinds of collectibles, even Rolex watches. Have you ever wanted a 40-acre plot of land in Texas or Wyoming? Governmentauction.com has it. If you're the winning bidder, you don't need to go through credit checks. You just make a few down payments, keep your monthly payments going for a few years, and the land is yours. While you're making payments, you can use the land just like you would if you owned it. I know I've always wanted a big piece of land where I could go and just hang out, hunt, or hang with my dogs. And it's easy to sign up and start bidding on something that catches your eye. Go to governmentauction.com. It takes less than 5 minutes. Governmentauction.com.
Thank you for listening. Remember to listen, share, and follow White Flag with Joe Walsh on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and everywhere great podcasts are found. And be sure to leave a 5-star review. This has been White Flag with Joe Walsh.